She called 911 on my fence. Yes, my fence. Claimed it was dangerous, unauthorized, and posed a threat to local harmony, as if Cedar Panels had joined a street gang. When I looked over the top, there stood Darlene Cotter, tape measure vigilante and self-declared president of an HOA that didn't actually exist. What followed was a masterclass in fake authority, theatrical emergency calls, and a clipboard so powerful it might have tried to annex my porch. Things escalated fast and hilariously. You won't believe how deep her delusion went. Ever had a neighbor like this? Drop your wildest HOA story in the comments. This one's got twists that make reality TV look like a nap. Now let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started. I bought this lakeside cabin back in March, looking for the perfect quiet retreat where I could focus on writing without city distractions. The property had everything: rustic cedar siding, wraparound porch overlooking Pine Lake, and space for a proper home office. The problem started when I realized how visible my workspace was to tourists who loved peering into cabin windows. When you're trying to concentrate on a complex murder mystery plot and someone's face is pressed against your window every 20 minutes, productivity disappears. I needed privacy, so I got proper permits and hired a crew to install a beautiful 6-foot cedar fence. For 3 days after installation, life was perfect. Then Darlene Cotter decided to make her grand entrance. I was deep into a tricky chapter when I heard someone aggressively measuring something outside. I looked up to see a woman in her early 40s, dressed like she was heading to a corporate board meeting despite being at a casual lakeside community, standing at my fence with a clipboard and the kind of facial expression that suggested she'd discovered a serious crime in progress. "Excuse me, sir," she announced in a voice that could cut glass, marching up to my porch like she owned the place. "We need to talk about this fence situation. I'm Darlene Cotter, and I'm the president of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. This fence violates our community standards, and you'll need to remove it immediately." She held up official-looking papers with what appeared to be letterhead, though I couldn't read the details from where I was standing. I explained that I'd checked with city planning, had all proper permits, and the fence was completely legal according to county regulations. "Permits don't matter if the HOA says no," Darlene shot back, her voice rising with each word. "I've been president here for 8 years, and this lake has standards, Mr. Rusk. You obviously don't understand community living." The more she talked, the more red flags started going up. Her papers looked homemade. She was measuring with a cloth sewing tape rather than professional equipment, and she acted like she owned the entire lakefront. When I asked for actual HOA documentation and bylaws, she became even more aggressive, refusing to provide specifics and insisting I trust her authority. The conversation ended with Darlene storming off my property, declaring that I had exactly 24 hours to begin fence removal or she'd be forced to take official action. As I watched her march back to what I assumed was her cabin, the largest and most elaborate property on the lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with this whole situation. That evening, I spent several hours researching online, looking for any mention of an active Pine Lake Homeowners Association. What I found was absolutely nothing. No website, no registered organization with the county, no mention in any of my real estate paperwork. The more I searched, the more suspicious I became about Darlene Cotter and her claims of authority over my perfectly legal fence. The next morning, at exactly 8:47 a.m., while I was peacefully working on my latest chapter, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone calling 911 from somewhere very close to my property. "I need police immediately," came a voice I already recognized as Darlene Cotter's, though she was speaking loud enough that half the lake probably heard her dramatic performance. "There's a safety hazard at Pine Lake Road. An illegal fence is blocking emergency access, and children could be hurt." The way she was projecting her voice, it was clear this wasn't just a phone call. It was a performance designed to make sure everyone in the neighborhood knew that she was taking official action against the dangerous new resident. I continued writing, assuming that whatever emergency she was reporting would be handled appropriately by the authorities. But I have to admit I was curious about what kind of safety hazard could possibly exist around a professionally installed residential fence. About an hour and a half later, that curiosity was satisfied when a county police cruiser pulled up in my driveway. My first thought was genuine confusion. Was I actually in some kind of trouble? Had I somehow missed an important regulation or permit requirement? Officer Curtis Lane stepped out of his vehicle with the kind of professional demeanor that suggested he'd handled plenty of neighborhood disputes before, though his slightly tired expression hinted that he might already have an idea of what he was dealing with. "Good morning, sir. Officer Lane said as I walked out to meet him. "I'm responding to a report about a fence that might be creating safety issues. Mind if I take a look?" I was more than happy to cooperate, showing him around the property and explaining the entire installation process, including all the permits and professional work that had gone into the project. Meanwhile, Darlene appeared from somewhere nearby. I'm still not sure if she'd been watching my house or if she just had perfect timing, carrying her clipboard and measuring tape like she was part of some official inspection team. "Officer," she announced dramatically, "this fence is damn rust and needs to be removed immediately." What followed was about 20 minutes of the most absurd safety inspection I've ever witnessed. Darlene pointed at perfectly normal cedar fence boards like they were explosive devices, claimed that ambulances wouldn't be able to access properties that clearly had wide, unobstructed driveways, and insisted that the fence created driving hazards despite being a full 15 feet from the road edge. Officer Lane measured everything with professional equipment, checked all the sight lines, and even walked the perimeter to verify emergency vehicle access. His conclusion was swift and definitive. "Ma'am, this fence meets all county safety requirements. Ambulances can easily access all properties. Sight lines are completely clear, and there are no safety violations of any kind." But Darlene wasn't finished with her performance. "Well, it violates HOA architectural standards," she declared, pulling out her stack of homemade-looking documents. "I'm the president, and I know the rules. He needs written approval from the board." Officer Lane's response was patient but firm. "Ma'am, HOA rules don't override county building codes. This gentleman's permits are valid regardless of any private organization requirements. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one, and I can't enforce private organization rules." The look on Darlene's face when she realized that the police weren't going to do her bidding was absolutely priceless. A mixture of shock, frustration, and barely contained rage. The comedy reached its peak when Darlene insisted that Officer Lane measure the fence height with her cloth tape measure because his official police measuring device was somehow wrong. "Ma'am," he replied with admirable patience, "this is a calibrated law enforcement measurement tool." When she argued that her measurement showed 6 feet 2 inches instead of exactly 6 feet, he calmly explained that even if that were accurate, 6'2" would still be well within legal residential height limits. I quietly recorded the entire interaction on my phone, partly for my own protection and partly because the whole situation was so surreal that I wasn't sure anyone would believe it without evidence. As Officer Lane prepared to leave, he quietly mentioned that I should document any future interactions and that filing false police reports was a serious matter. Darlene, meanwhile, was muttering about taking this higher up and getting real authorities involved. She stormed off with her clipboard clutched to her chest like it contained state secrets, shouting over her shoulder that, "This isn't over, Mr. Rusk." I thanked Officer Lane for his professionalism and went back inside, thinking that surely this was the end of whatever weird power trip Darlene was on. That afternoon I received a certified mail delivery that proved I was very, very wrong about this being over. The envelope had an official-looking return address for something called Pine Lake HOA Board of Directors, with letterhead that looked suspiciously like it had been designed on someone's home computer. Inside was a violation notice demanding a $500 fine for unauthorized fence installation, along with threats of daily penalties until the fence was removed. As I stared at this obviously fake document, I realized that Darlene Cotter wasn't just some difficult neighbor. She was running some kind of elaborate scam, and I was apparently her latest target. That evening, I decided it was time to find out exactly what this HOA actually was and whether Darlene Cotter had any real authority whatsoever. The next morning, I started my investigation into the mysterious Pine Lake HOA by doing what any reasonable person would do in the digital age. I Googled everything I could think of. Pine Lake HOA Colorado returned absolutely nothing. Pine Lake Homeowners Association gave me results for similarly named communities in other states, but nothing local. The county registrar's website had no record of any active homeowners association for our area. Even my original real estate paperwork made no mention whatsoever of any HOA requirements, fees, or restrictions. The more I searched, the more convinced I became that Darlene Cotter was running some kind of elaborate fraud operation. While I was busy discovering that her authority was completely fictional, Darlene was apparently escalating her campaign. At exactly 2:30 that afternoon, I heard her making another 911 call, this time reporting a property line dispute and claiming that my fence was built on her land. "I need police for theft of property and trespassing," she announced to the emergency dispatcher. "My neighbor built a fence on my land, and I have a surveyor here who can prove it." About an hour later, a young man showed up at Darlene's house, wearing an orange safety vest and carrying a clipboard, looking nervous and unprepared. When Officer Lane returned to my property, and I could tell by his facial expression that he was getting tired of these calls, he found Darlene and her supposed surveyor standing at my fence with a consumer-grade measuring wheel from any hardware store. The surveyor looked to be in his early 20s, was clearly nervous, and kept looking to Darlene for instructions. His hands were actually shaking as he held the measuring device, and when he tried to take notes, I could see his pen trembling on the clipboard. Tommy's eyes darted between Officer Lane and his clipboard, sweat forming at his temple. His lips moved, but no words came. Then, just loud enough to shake the crowd's attention, he whispered, "Mom, I don't want to lie again. Not like last time." Darlene's face went rigid with panic as she grabbed her son's arm firmly and hissed under her breath, "Just say he crossed the property line. You want us to get sued?" Officer Lane's eyebrows went up, clearly catching the family dynamic and the implication that this wasn't their first fraudulent scheme. Officer Lane's first question was perfectly reasonable. "Son, may I see your surveyor's license?" Tommy's response was immediate panic, his face going completely white. It's in the truck," he stammered, looking desperately at Darlene for help. You could practically see the sweat forming on his forehead as he realized he was in way over his head. "Please retrieve it," Officer Lane said calmly. And that's when the whole charade started falling apart. Meanwhile, I noticed something interesting happening around us. Mrs. Peterson from across the lake was discreetly filming the entire confrontation from her deck, clearly recognizing that this was worth documenting. She was actually live streaming on her phone, and I could hear her providing commentary. "Y'all, this is Pine Lake drama at its finest. This lady's been terrorizing the neighborhood for years, and now she's got her poor son pretending to be a surveyor." A couple of other neighbors had also appeared with their phones out, and someone behind me whispered, "That's her son, not a real surveyor. This is getting ridiculous." The fake surveyor claimed he'd actually left his license at the office, then that he'd forgotten to bring it, and finally admitted that he wasn't exactly licensed yet, but was learning the profession. Tommy's voice cracked as he said, "Mom, I can't do this anymore," loud enough for everyone to hear. The word "mom" immediately revealed the family connection and made the fraud obvious to everyone present. Officer Lane's patience was clearly wearing thin as he asked directly, "Son, are you a certified surveyor by the state of Colorado?" The answer was a barely audible "No, sir," followed by Tommy asking if they could just leave now. While this comedy of errors was unfolding, I quietly showed Officer Lane the actual property markers, clearly visible stone boundaries that showed my fence was a full 3 feet inside my own property line. The fake surveyor's measurements with his hardware store equipment had somehow produced 3 different results for the same distance, and Officer Lane watched this performance with growing professional irritation. "Ma'am," he finally said in a tone that carried serious warning, "one more false report, Miss Cotter, and we won't be talking about civil matters anymore. Filing false police reports is a crime, and I'm getting tired of being called out here for your personal disputes." The crowd of neighbors watching from various porches and yards began murmuring among themselves, and I heard Mrs. Peterson announce to her live stream audience, "And that's how you handle a fake HOA, Karen, folks. Subscribe for more Pine Lake drama." The community was definitely starting to wake up to what was really happening here, and Darlene's face was getting redder by the minute as she realized her authority was crumbling in front of an audience. That evening, an elderly neighbor named Elsie Hammond knocked on my door with a plate of homemade cookies and some very interesting information. "Honey," she said in a grandmother's voice that immediately put me at ease, "you need to know something about that woman. Come over for coffee tomorrow morning. There's a lot you don't know about Darlene Cotter." As I accepted her kind invitation, I had no idea that I was about to learn just how deep Darlene's deception actually went, or how many other families she'd already driven away from this peaceful lakeside community. The next morning at Elsie Hammond's kitchen table, surrounded by the warm smell of fresh coffee and homemade cookies, I learned the shocking truth about Darlene Cotter and her completely fictional HOA presidency. Elsie had lived at Pine Lake for over 15 years and had watched Darlene's behavior escalate from merely difficult neighbor to full-scale community fraud. "Dear," Elsie said, opening a weathered cardboard box filled with yellowed documents, faded photographs, and what looked like official correspondence, "you're not the first victim, and if someone doesn't stop her, you won't be the last." What she showed me next was absolutely mind-blowing. Official dissolution papers from January of 2018, proving that the Pine Lake HOA had been legally dissolved over 4 years ago due to mismanagement and lack of participation. But here's the truly shocking part. Darlene Cotter had never been the legitimate president of anything. Even when the HOA actually existed, she was just a regular member who constantly complained at meetings and tried to impose her personal preferences on everyone else. Elsie pulled out original meeting minutes that showed Darlene's pattern of disruption and control attempts, along with resignation letters from board members who couldn't tolerate her behavior. She's been collecting $200 a month from 15 different families for over 4 years, Elsie explained, showing me bank deposit records and copies of fake invoices that proved Darlene had stolen nearly $20,000 through this elaborate scam. But the money was just part of it. She wanted the power, the control over everyone's lives. Elsie's voice trembled with years of suppressed anger as she described watching neighbor after neighbor fall victim to Darlene's systematic harassment campaigns. "You want to know how deep this goes?" Elsie asked, pulling out a manila folder thick with documentation. 3 years ago, Darlene issued me a violation notice for hanging an American flag on my porch, said it violated architectural harmony standards. When I refused to take it down, she threatened to have my property seized for non-compliance. I'm a 71-year-old widow, and she had me so scared I actually considered taking down my own flag. Elsie's eyes filled with tears of rage and humiliation. That's when I started keeping records of everything she did to people. The pattern was always the same, according to documentation Elsie had carefully preserved. Darlene would target new residents or anyone who questioned her authority, then launch an escalating campaign of harassment using fake HOA violations, threats of legal action, and social pressure from other neighbors who still believed she had legitimate authority. The Miller family, Elsie said, pulling out a heartbreaking letter, they had a 7-year-old daughter. I'll never forget when Mrs. Miller came to my door crying because Darlene had pointed at that little girl and said, "If your parents don't remove that deck, your family will be sued and you'll lose your home." That child had nightmares for weeks. Elsie showed me photographs and documentation from each family that had been driven away. The Millers had saved for years to buy their dream lakeside cabin, only to be harassed into selling after 6 months of constant fake violations about their deck. They were a young couple just starting out, Elsie explained. Darlene made their lives so miserable they actually believed they might lose everything. They sold for $30,000 below what they'd paid, just to escape her. The Pratts in 2021 had endured months of harassment about their garden, before finally giving up and moving away. Elsie showed me photographs Darlene had taken of their property, measuring their flower beds with her cloth tape measure and documenting supposed violations of completely fictional landscaping codes. She told them their roses were the wrong color for lakeside aesthetics, Elsie said with disgust. When they planted tulips instead, she cited them for non-navigable species violations. There's no such thing, but they didn't know that. The worst part, Elsie continued, her voice breaking slightly, was watching how she turned neighbors against each other. She'd tell Mrs. Adams that the Johnsons were bringing down property values, then tell the Johnsons that Mrs. Adams was complaining about their children. She created so much suspicion and fear that people stopped talking to each other. That's how she maintained control, divide and conquer. Just last year, the Johnson family had been driven away after Darlene claimed their boat dock violated community waterway standards. Elsie had copies of the fake violation notices, complete with official-looking letterhead and threats of $1,000 fines. That dock had been there for 12 years before Darlene decided it was a problem, Elsie explained, but Mr. Johnson was a single father with 2 teenagers, and he couldn't afford a legal battle against someone who seemed to have official backing. He sold everything and moved to an apartment in town. While I was learning this incredible truth about Darlene's systematic community destruction, she was busy escalating her campaign against me to dangerous new levels. That afternoon, while I was still at Elsie's house with multiple witnesses, Darlene made her third and most serious 911 call yet. "I need help immediately," she told the emergency dispatcher, her voice carrying across the lake like a theatrical performance. "My neighbor is threatening me. He came to my property screaming obscenities and threatening to make me pay for interfering with his fence. I'm scared for my safety." Every single word was a complete lie, but it was the kind of serious allegation that police have to investigate thoroughly. Officer Lane arrived looking more serious than before because threatening behavior is actual criminal activity. When he asked if I had visited Darlene's property, I provided a perfect alibi. I had been at Elsie's house since 10 a.m. with multiple witnesses. Elsie herself verified that I had been drinking coffee in her kitchen during the exact time when Darlene claimed I was making threats. "You know what the real tragedy is?" Elsie asked as we watched Officer Lane drive away after confirming my alibi. "This used to be the most beautiful, peaceful community you could imagine. Neighbors helped each other, children played together, families gathered for barbecues by the lake. Darlene destroyed all of that with her fake authority and manufactured conflicts. She didn't just steal money, she stole our sense of community." That evening, armed with the truth about Darlene's elaborate fraud and a box full of evidence from Elsie's careful documentation, I realized that this wasn't just about my fence anymore. This was about exposing a systematic fraud that had destroyed lives and driven families from their homes. I needed evidence, documentation, and a way to expose her completely. But most importantly, I needed to help rebuild the community trust that Darlene had spent years destroying through her fake authority and manufactured fear. While Darlene was busy creating her fake evidence, I was busy gathering real evidence of her elaborate fraud operation. I contacted the 3 families she'd previously driven away, and all of them were eager to share their documentation of her harassment campaigns. The Miller family still had copies of the fake violation notices they'd received about their deck. The Pratts had photographs of Darlene measuring their garden with her cloth tape measure and issuing fake fines. The Johnson family had actually consulted a lawyer about Darlene's threats before deciding it was easier to just sell their cabin and move away. Within hours of capturing this footage, I contacted Officer Lane and provided him with copies of the video evidence. "If she's willing to commit vandalism in the dark," I wrote in my email, "I'm bringing it into the light of justice. Please let me know what additional documentation you need for prosecution." 15 minutes later, he replied, "Keep those cameras running. We're opening a formal investigation into fraud and harassment." The feeling of finally having law enforcement take this seriously was incredibly empowering. But I knew that law enforcement alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild the community trust that Darlene had destroyed. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I reached out to every neighbor I could identify, asking them to meet for an informal gathering to discuss community concerns. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 2 hours, I had 12 families agreeing to meet the next evening at the community dock. The gathering that night was unlike anything Pine Lake had seen in years. Families who hadn't spoken to each other in months because of Darlene's manufactured conflicts finally had a chance to share their experiences. Mrs. Adams discovered that the Johnsons had never actually complained about her children. That had been one of Darlene's lies to create division. The Pratt family, who were thinking about moving back to the area, joined us via video call to share their documentation of harassment. As our community group compiled all this evidence into a comprehensive report, something remarkable happened during one of our evening meetings at the lakeshore. We'd been sharing stories and documentation for about an hour when Mr. Leonard, a quiet man in his 60s who lived in the yellow cabin, suddenly stood up. He'd been silent through most of our previous gatherings, always sitting on the periphery and listening, but never contributing. "For 2 years, I thought I was the coward," Mr. Leonard said, his voice shaking as he stepped forward into the circle. "I paid her fake dues. I helped her put up those fraudulent community notices on the bulletin board. I didn't speak up when she harassed the Pratts about their garden. I watched the Millers get driven away, and I said nothing." His voice grew stronger with each confession. "But not anymore. I have documentation too. I have records of every fake fine she made me pay, every threatening letter she sent. And I'm ready to testify." A heavy silence fell over our group as the weight of his words sank in. This wasn't just about my fence anymore. This was about a community finding its collective voice after years of systematic intimidation. And then, one by one, others began to nod. Mrs. Chen pulled out her own manila folder. The Stevens family shared text messages they'd saved. Even some of the teenagers who had been filming Darlene's schemes volunteered their video evidence. "I can't believe we all went through this alone," said Mark Stevens, a neighbor I'd barely spoken to before. "If we'd just talked to each other earlier, we could have stopped this years ago." Sarah Chen, who had moved to the less desirable side of the lake because of Darlene's harassment, wiped away tears as she described losing her dream home. "I thought I was the only one. I thought I was going crazy." We established a secure group chat that night with 15 families participating and sharing evidence, support, and coordination for the fight ahead. Elsie appointed herself as our unofficial historian, providing documentation of everything Darlene had done over the years. Tonight, she said with fierce determination, we stop being victims and start being a community again. As we looked around at the faces gathered in the fading lakeside light, I realized that Darlene hadn't just created victims. She'd accidentally created the strongest, most unified community Pine Lake had ever seen. One evening, while reviewing camera footage on my laptop with several neighbors who had come over to help analyze the evidence, I heard a knock at my door. Standing on my porch was a woman I'd never met before, holding a manila envelope and looking nervous but determined. "Mr. Rusk," she said, "I'm Sarah Chen from the North Shore. I heard about what's been happening with Darlene, and I think you should see this." Inside the envelope were copies of fake violation notices Darlene had sent her family 3 years ago, along with photographs and a detailed timeline of harassment that had ultimately forced them to sell their original cabin and move to a smaller property. The most revealing evidence came from Darlene's own online documentation, where she'd been recording her HOA president duties for years. Her digital records showed her issuing fake violations, organizing fake community meetings, and positioning herself as the ultimate authority over lakeside property standards. She'd even taken photos of herself with fake surveyor equipment, measuring other people's property and claiming various violations. The digital trail of her fraud was extensive and completely self-documented. She'd been so proud of her fake authority that she'd created a permanent record of her own criminal activity. As I kept thinking about the anonymous warning I'd received about Darlene's next big scheme, I contacted the county building department and arranged for a legitimate inspection of my property for the following morning at exactly 9 a.m. But this time I wouldn't be facing Darlene alone. I'd have an entire community standing behind me, ready to expose her fraud operation once and for all. We'd gone from being isolated victims to being a united force for justice, and tomorrow would prove just how powerful that transformation really was. The morning of reckoning arrived with perfect weather for what was about to become the most spectacular public exposure of fraud that Pine Lake had ever witnessed. At 8:30 a.m., I could see Darlene coaching her son Danny in her backyard, helping him put on a hard hat and orange safety vest while reviewing notes on a clipboard. Danny looked nervous and unprepared, exactly like someone who was about to impersonate a county building inspector without any actual qualifications or authority. Meanwhile, I was calmly waiting for the real county inspector to arrive, knowing that this confrontation would finally put an end to Darlene's elaborate scam once and for all. By 8:45, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, drawn by the unusual activity and sensing that something significant was about to happen. Mrs. Peterson from across the lake had brought her morning coffee and positioned herself on her deck with a clear view of my property, phone already recording and streaming live. "Good morning, Pine Lake drama fans," she announced to her audience. "Today we're witnessing what might be the final chapter of our neighborhood's biggest fraud scandal. Buckle up, because this is about to get epic." The elderly couple from the blue cabin had walked over with their dog, pretending to be on a casual stroll, but clearly hoping to witness whatever drama was unfolding. Even the teenagers from the rental cabin had wandered over, phones ready to capture whatever was about to happen. One of them was already creating content, whispering commentary about the fake HOA drama about to explode, and adding captions like POV, when your mom makes you pretend to be a building inspector but the actual government shows up. The energy in the air was electric. Everyone could sense that years of community frustration were about to reach a breaking point. At 8:45, Danny approached my fence with exaggerated authority, clipboard in hand and hard hat slightly too large for his head. I could see his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the clipboard, and when he spoke, his voice had an uncertain quality that made his inexperience obvious. "Sir, I'm here to inspect this structure for building code violations," he announced, trying too hard to sound official. Internally, I could almost hear his thoughts. "Mom said just read the lines right and everyone will believe me. But I'm shaking so bad I can barely hold this clipboard and everyone's watching." Darlene was filming everything on her phone, clearly planning to use this fake inspection as evidence against me in whatever legal action she imagined she could take. I played along perfectly, welcoming the inspector and inviting him to examine the fence thoroughly, while quietly checking my watch and waiting for the real show to begin. Several neighbors in the watching crowd had their phones out, and I heard someone providing live commentary. This is going straight to social media. Plot twist: fake HOA president gets inspected herself. The irony is absolutely delicious. Danny's performance was amateur hour from the very beginning. He measured the fence with a cloth tape measure, took notes on blank paper, and made up violations that didn't exist in any actual building code. "This fence exceeds height regulations," he declared, his voice cracking slightly with nerves. "The foundation depth is improper for this soil type," he added, clearly making up technical-sounding problems that had no basis in reality. Several neighbors in the watching crowd exchanged skeptical glances, and I heard someone call out, "That boy doesn't look old enough to inspect a sandwich, let alone a fence." At exactly 9 a.m., a county truck with government plates pulled into my driveway, and Inspector Martinez stepped out with professional equipment and legitimate credentials. The look on Danny's face when he saw the real inspector was absolutely priceless. Pure panic mixed with the sudden realization that his mother's scheme was about to explode in spectacular fashion. The gathered crowd immediately sensed the drama that was about to unfold, with several people repositioning themselves for better camera angles and someone starting enhanced live commentary. "Y'all, this is about to be legendary. Real inspector just showed up to the fake inspector party. This is better than any reality TV show." "Excuse me," Inspector Martinez said politely but firmly. "Who are you and what are you doing?" Danny's response was a stammering mess. I'm the inspector?" The question mark at the end of his sentence made it clear that even he wasn't sure about his supposed authority. A murmur went through the crowd of watching neighbors, and Mrs. Peterson announced to her live stream, "Did this child just question mark his own fake job title? The secondhand embarrassment is real, folks." Danny suddenly pulled off his hard hat, his eyes welling up with tears. "Mom, they're recording us. I can't do this anymore. I'm not doing this," he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, his voice breaking with emotion. The crowd fell silent, recognizing that they were witnessing a young man finally refusing to participate in his mother's fraudulent schemes. Someone in the crowd whispered, "That poor kid has been dragged into this mess for years."
"Police department?"
Inspector Martinez asked, pulling out his official identification and badge. Danny looked desperately at Darlene, who had stopped filming and was clearly realizing that disaster was imminent. "The building department?" Danny replied, again with that uncertain question mark that made his lack of credentials obvious to everyone watching. When Inspector Martinez asked to see Danny's county identification and inspector number, the fake inspector's performance completely collapsed. "It's in my truck," he mumbled. Then, "I forgot it at the office." And finally, in a moment that sent ripples of sympathetic laughter through the crowd, "Mom, I want to go home. Please, can we just go home?" The word "mom" sent a collective gasp through the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch this confrontation, because it immediately revealed the family connection and made the fraud obvious to everyone present. Suddenly, a voice from the crowd broke the stunned silence. It was Mr. Torres, who had been one of Darlene's most intimidated victims. "She fined me $500 for my porch light," he shouted, his voice carrying years of suppressed anger. "Said it violated community lighting standards. Now it's her turn to get inspected." Inspector Martinez became very serious very quickly. "Ma'am," he said to Darlene, "impersonating a county official is a felony under Colorado state law. Son, you need to explain yourself right now." Danny was clearly in over his head and ready to confess everything, but Darlene was still trying to salvage her elaborate scheme by claiming this was all a misunderstanding and that they needed to leave immediately. The gathered crowd of neighbors began murmuring among themselves, sharing stories of their own encounters with Darlene's fake violations and suddenly understanding that they'd all been victims of the same elaborate scam. A little girl in the crowd tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Mommy, isn't that the lady who told us we couldn't ride our bikes in our own yard?" Her mother's response carried across the silent crowd. "Yes, honey. And now we know who really should have been getting in trouble all along." The moment of community realization was palpable. Years of intimidation and fake authority were crumbling in real time, and people were finally finding their voices to speak up against the fraud they'd endured. That's when I presented Inspector Martinez with all the evidence I'd gathered over the past week. Video footage of Darlene trespassing and damaging my property, audio recordings of her coaching fake inspectors, documentation of her 4-year fraud operation, and proof that she'd been collecting fake HOA dues from neighbors for years. Inspector Martinez reviewed my fence professionally and declared it completely legal and properly constructed, exceeding all safety standards and meeting every county requirement. He then called for police backup to investigate the impersonation charges and fraud allegations. When Officer Lane arrived and saw Darlene again, his expression was pure professional frustration, mixed with satisfaction that this ongoing problem was finally being resolved through proper legal channels. "Ms. Cotter," he said with weary authority, "this is the 4th time I've been called to this address in 10 days. And now we're dealing with impersonating a government official. You have the right to remain silent." As Darlene was read her rights for fraud and her son was arrested for impersonation, the gathered neighbors began sharing their own stories of harassment and fake violations, creating a growing chorus of victims who had finally found their voice. The most satisfying moment came when Inspector Martinez announced that as part of his investigation, he would be conducting a thorough inspection of Darlene's own property to check for the very violations she'd been accusing others of. After 4 years of filing complaints about other people's properties, he said with professional satisfaction, "It's time to see if Ms. Cotter's house meets the same standards she's been demanding from everyone else." The irony was absolutely perfect. The fake HOA president who had been harassing people about building codes was about to discover what a real building inspection actually looked like. 3 weeks later, the most humiliating moment of Darlene's downfall arrived when the moving truck pulled up to her cabin. The real estate agent had warned her that the property's legal issues and community reputation would significantly impact the sale price, and indeed, she was forced to accept an offer $30,000 below market value. As she supervised the loading of her belongings, not a single neighbor came to say goodbye or wish her well. The silence was deafening. A community that had lived in fear of her fake authority for 4 years was collectively turning its back on her. Tommy, now 23 and facing the consequences of his mother's schemes, carried the last box to the truck with his head down, unable to make eye contact with any of the neighbors who had gathered to watch the departure. But as he reached the truck's tailgate, something made him stop. He turned back one last time, his eyes scanning the faces of neighbors he'd once helped his mother terrorize. No one met his gaze at first, until Elsie, the 71-year-old widow he'd watched his mother harass for years, stepped forward from the crowd. "Tommy," Elsie said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent lakeside air. The young man looked up, expecting anger or condemnation. Instead, Elsie's eyes held something he hadn't seen in years, compassion mixed with firm resolve. "Be better than her," she said simply, but those 4 words carried the weight of forgiveness and challenge all at once. Tommy's composure finally broke, and tears streamed down his face as he nodded and whispered, "I will. I promise I will." Danny, still dealing with his own legal troubles from the fake inspector incident, had already moved in with relatives in another state, too ashamed to face the community his mother had terrorized for years. The last anyone had heard, he was working at a hardware store and trying to rebuild his life away from the shadow of his mother's criminal schemes, attending therapy to deal with the trauma of being forced to participate in fraud from such a young age. As the moving truck pulled away from Pine Lake for the final time, carrying Darlene Cotter and the remnants of her fake empire, something beautiful and unexpected happened. Without any formal planning or organization, neighbors began emerging from their homes with folding chairs, coolers, and picnic supplies. Nobody had called for a gathering, but somehow everyone knew this moment needed to be marked. Elsie appeared with a huge tray of homemade cookies, several families brought beverages and snacks to share, and the children who had been forbidden to play freely for years suddenly filled the air with laughter and joy. "Nobody planned this," Mrs. Peterson said as she set up her chair by the lake shore, "but it feels like we're finally celebrating the community we always should have been." For the first time in 4 years, Pine Lake echoed with the sounds of genuine neighborly conversation, children playing without fear of fake violations, and the kind of peaceful community spirit that Darlene had systematically destroyed through her reign of manufactured terror. Mr. Torres, who had been one of Darlene's most intimidated victims, brought out his guitar and started playing folk songs by the water. "I haven't played outside in 3 years," he admitted to the gathered crowd. "She told me music violated noise ordinances during community quiet hours, which apparently were any hours she didn't like music." The spontaneous community celebration continued well into the evening, with neighbors sharing stories, children playing games that had been forbidden for years, and a general sense of freedom that nobody had felt in a very long time. As the impromptu celebration continued into the evening, There was only the sound of wind moving across the water mixed with the happy voices of people who were finally free to be themselves in their own homes. For the first time in 4 years, Pine Lake was truly peaceful when it needed to be, and joyfully alive when it should be. Not the oppressive silence of fear that Darlene had created, but the natural rhythm of a healthy community, where people respected each other without manufactured authority and fake rules. My fence, the innocent cedar structure that had started this entire saga, remained exactly where it belonged, 6 feet tall, perfectly legal, and providing exactly the privacy I'd wanted for my writing. But it had become so much more than just property boundaries. The fence didn't just block out noise and prying eyes. It had blocked out fear itself, and for the first time in many years, everyone in our community could breathe freely, knowing that fake authority had been replaced by genuine mutual respect and the kind of neighborly cooperation that makes lakeside living truly special. 6 months later, I'm still here at Pine Lake, writing my mystery novels in peaceful privacy behind my perfectly legal 6-foot fence. The lake view is as beautiful as ever, my neighbors are genuinely friendly people, and there hasn't been a single fake violation notice or false police report since Darlene's fraud empire collapsed. Sometimes I sit on my porch in the evening, watching the sunset reflect off the water, and think about this whole incredible experience. The community has continued to thrive in ways that surprised everyone. We now have genuine monthly gatherings that people actually want to attend. No fake authority required. The teenagers who filmed Darlene's downfall have become local legends, with their videos serving as cautionary tales shared throughout neighboring lake communities. Mr. Leonard has become our unofficial community coordinator, organizing volunteer cleanup days and legitimate improvement projects that actually benefit everyone. Even Tommy sends us occasional updates from his new life. He's studying to become a real building inspector, determined to use proper authority to help communities rather than terrorize them. Property values have risen 15% since word spread about our fake HOA liberation, and 3 new families have moved in specifically because they heard about our genuine community spirit. The Miller family even visited last month, considering a move back now that the neighborhood harassment has ended. As for Darlene, the last anyone heard, she was living in a small apartment 2 towns over, still facing ongoing legal consequences and apparently banned from participating in any homeowner associations, real or imagined. A cedar fence, 6 feet tall. That's all it took to bring down a fake empire and rebuild something real, to transform a community of frightened, isolated individuals into neighbors who stand together against anyone who tries to abuse power through fear and lies.
Appreciate you sticking with us at QA Stories. Hit that bell so you never miss a moment, because things only get crazier from here.